December 26, 1996. JonBenét Ramsey, a little girl is found murdered in the basement of her own home. No forced entry. A ransom note left behind. A case that splits America. But while the headlines chased the Ramseys, there was another name briefly mentioned, then forgotten. Chris Wolf. A journalist. A boyfriend. A man who came home that night acting unlike himself. A man whose girlfriend thought he could be the killer. But why would she think that? What did she see in his behavior that night that made her so afraid? Was it something he said? Something he couldn't explain? Or was it simply a gut instinct that something was terribly wrong? And why was his name swept under the rug so quickly despite a huge number of unbeatable evidence? Jackie's testimony. Jackie DILSON, sometimes referred to as Jackie Wilson, wasn't a detective. She wasn't a journalist. She worked as a part-time office manager for a small nonprofit and lived a quiet, almost invisible life in Boulder, Colorado. She had no reason to get involved in one of the country's most sensational murder cases. But sometimes, the people closest to the noise are ones who hear what no one else does. Jackie was the type of person who remembered details. Not just what someone wore, but how they shifted in their seat, how long they paused before answering, what they didn't say. Her friends described her as quiet, but persistent. Her words didn't come fast, but when they did, they came loaded with clarity. In 1996, she was living with Chris Wolf. Their relationship had its problems, arguments, distance, emotional cold spots, but nothing that prepared her for what happened that Christmas night. She remembers it vividly. The silence before he entered. The smell of sweat and soil. The quick, almost manic way he moved through the apartment. Jackie said. He looked like someone trying to undo something they couldn't take back. He refused to say where he'd been. He was covered in dirt, possibly leaves. He stripped off his clothes and washed them immediately. He hid his boots deep in the closet. He ranted loudly, bitterly about the Ramseys, and how fake the whole thing felt. Jackie didn't screen accuse. She documented. She pulled out her journal and began writing everything down: the time he got home, what he looked like, the words he used, how his eyes wouldn't settle. She wasn't even sure what she was seeing yet. But she knew it wasn't right. In the days that followed, her unease turned into obsession. She compared timelines, tracked news coverage, matched behaviors. Eventually, she wrote a formal timeline of Chris's actions before and after the murder. Then she did something that very few people in her position would done. She called the police. She turned over her notes. She reached out to John Ramsey. She do everything. But the silence that came back was louder than anything she had expected. No one followed up. No detective ever knocked on her door. No one cross-examined her, doubted her, or challenged her. But no one believed her either. It was like shouting into fog. She waited days, weeks, months for something to move. A call. A letter. A sign that what she said had mattered. Instead, the case moved on. Headlines changed, new theories emerged. Chris Wolf's name faded into the background, so she tried again. She contacted attorneys, hoping someone would help her push for action. She reached out to media producers, reporters, even victim advocacy groups. Some listened, most didn't. Her testimony didn't have blood, or footage, or a smoking gun. Just memory. Just pattern. Just a woman saying, "Something's not right." And in a case obsessed with image and noise, Jackie's quiet clarity was too easy to ignore. Eventually, because she doubted herself, but because she realized no one was going to listen. Her story didn't vanish. It was buried. And all she could do was remember. Chris Wolf's background and public image. Chris Wolf was, in many ways, the kind of man who never fully belonged to the world around him. In the 1990s, he lived in Boulder, Colorado, not as a fixture of its polished suburbs or cozy downtown circles, but as a fringe presence. He moved through life quietly, but with a charged intensity, like someone carrying invisible thunder. A freelance journalist with no permanent newsroom or editorial chain to report to, he chose independence over stability. That freedom came at a cost. Financial uncertainty, professional isolation, and a growing sense of detachment from the community he lived in. People barely noticed him in grocery lines or bookstores. He was not part of the town's social rhythm, not someone invited to neighborhood barbecues or holiday gatherings. His most constant human connection during that time was Jackie DILSON, a woman whose own quiet nature might have mirrored his in calmer days before things changed. Wolf's worldview was not shaped by diplomacy or polite detachment. His writing, often buried in niche publications or circulated among like-minded readers, pulsed with contempt for social facades and the powerful figures who, in his eyes, controlled the narrative. He loathed the elite. He distrusted government institutions. He believed the media was little more than a puppet stage for lies. His articles didn't flirt with controversy, they lunged at it. They were biting, visceral, and frequently laced with disdain for what he saw as America's obsession with wealth and celebrity. He didn't just critique power structures, he dissected them with verbal precision. But beneath the prose, there was a deeper undercurrent of anger that felt less political and more personal. There was always the sense that he wasn't just reporting on corruption or hypocrisy, he was wrestling with it. Not from a distance, but from deep within his own emotional unrest. To those who crossed paths with Chris Wolf, neighbors, acquaintances, former colleagues, he often left an impression that was difficult to define. He wasn't aggressive in public. He didn't raise red flags with law enforcement. On paper, his record was clean: no arrests, no violent incidents, nothing that screamed danger. And yet, people described him with terms that always stopped short of comfort. Strange but harmless, some said. Odd but not threatening. He was the kind of man who spoke passionately, but sometimes too intensely, who could be charming until he wasn't. Jackie DILSON, the woman who knew him best, saw something deeper, something darker. She recalled moments when he would lose himself in angry spirals, his voicing, his hands shaking, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. He would rant about society, about manipulation, about children and violence in the media. It wasn't just theory, it was personal, emotional, raw. He said things that lingered, that unsettled. Things that made Jackie quietly wonder, what is he really capable of? She watched him go from brooding silence to explosive commentary, especially when the topic turned to crime, power, or control. She didn't see a killer, but she saw the possibility of one. Yet in the wider public eye, Chris Wolf barely registered. He wasn't featured in headlines when the JonBenét case broke. His name didn't appear in nightly news rundowns or early morning press briefings. He wasn't someone the media fixated on, not then, not when the trail was still warm. His emergence came later, tangential and obscure, mentioned in lawsuits and whispered in comment threads. When John and Patsy Ramsey published their book, The Death of Innocence, and implied that Chris Wolf was a viable suspect, he sued for defamation. The case made a ripple, not a wave. He lost. But the media didn't pick it up and run. Documentaries barely included his name. Investigative series skipped past him. In the grand story of JonBenét's death, Chris Wolf became a shadow too peripheral to spotlight, too suspicious to ignore. He existed in a liminal space, not guilty, not exonerated, just unsettled. And maybe, for the public and the press alike, that ambiguity was easier to live with than digging any deeper. So why was Chris Wolf forgotten? Why did his name fade, while others were endlessly on television screens and in tabloids? Part of the answer lies in the cold, clinical nature of evidence. There was no blood tying him to the basement, no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing physical that screamed, he was here. In a case where the public demanded certainty, traceable facts, undeniable links, Chris Wolf was smoke, not fire. The Boulder police never made him a formal suspect, and they never announced a thorough investigation into his background. Without an official target on his back, The spotlight turned elsewhere and stayed there. There was also something about his image that made him easy to overlook. He wasn't a father in front of the cameras, trembling and tearful. He wasn't a pageant mother in a sparkling jacket. He didn't fit the theater of tragedy. Wolf was quiet, with strange in ways that didn't sell headlines. In the eyes of the press, he was background noise. Static. Not the center of the drama. And yet, what lingers, what truly disturbs those who revisit the case, is the silence that surrounded him. A woman who lived with him, who slept beside him, who knew his moods and his tempers and his tells, went to the police and said something was wrong. She handed over notes, patterns, behaviors. She said she was afraid. And nothing happened. No knock. No questions. No spotlight. So maybe the real question isn't why the world forgot about Chris Wolf, but why it was so willing to. But the silence around Chris Wolf didn't just settle, it deepened. After the lawsuit was dismissed, he didn't fight back. He didn't give interviews. He didn't show up in front of cameras to defend himself. He didn't push to clear his name in the court of public opinion. He simply vanished. For a man who once raged against media manipulation and accused others of hiding behind facades, his complete withdrawal from the spotlight jarring, calculated. Even. It's not just that he was forgotten. It's that he allowed himself to be. No op-eds. No podcast rebuttals. No published memoirs titled, "What They Got Wrong About Me." For someone so consumed with the JonBenét case, someone Jackie once said, couldn't stop watching the coverage, couldn't stop talking about it, his absence became louder than his words ever were. And that raises the uncomfortable question, was Chris Wolf forgotten? Or did he make sure he would be? Jackie's theories. Jackie DILSON never claimed to be a profiler, but she knew what she saw. And what she saw in Chris Wolf the night of JonBenét Ramsey's murder, his clothes, his mood, his silence, never made sense to her. Not then. Not years later. And certainly not now. She didn't have a confession. She didn't find a weapon. But what she did have was a story that never changed, and a list of things that, to her, pointed to something dark. Her theories weren't built on science. They were built on instinct. On years of watching a man unravel from the inside, and a single night when all that unraveling seemed to spill out into reality. First, Jackie believed Chris held a deep resentment toward wealth and status. He wasn't just critical of the Ramseys. He loathed everything they stood for. He often mocked them, called them fake, artificial, hollow. He believed their public image was constructed, manipulated, and Jackie started to see a dangerous line between opinion and obsession. He also had an intense, conflicted relationship with media. He followed the news closely, talked about it constantly, but his words weren't admiration, they were disgust. He believed the media was a circus, and those caught in it deserved what came. To Jackie, it felt like Chris didn't just hate the Ramseys, he hated the world that protected them. Control was another theme. Chris hated feeling small or powerless. When things in life spiraled, he lashed out, sometimes at her, sometimes at the world. Jackie remembered thinking, more than once, if Chris ever felt truly out of control, he might do something unthinkable just to feel power again. Jackie didn't think it was premeditated. Her theory, that Chris may have encountered JonBenét in a moment of opportunity. Maybe he followed her. Maybe he knew the layout of the house. Maybe it started as a confrontation, a need to disrupt their perfect world, and it went further than he ever meant. Then, the cover-up, the ransom note, the duct tape, the garrote. To Jackie, these weren't tools of a calculated killer. They were theatrical. Symbolic. They screamed confusion, panic, and shame. Chris hated symbols. He said JonBenét was made into one. A child pageant queen with lipstick and tiaras. Jackie wondered if he'd tried to destroy that symbol. Not because he hated her, but because he hated what she represented. There were other possibilities too. Jackie allowed for them. Maybe Chris didn't kill JonBenét. Maybe he knew who did. Maybe he helped someone cover it up. Maybe he saw something and chose to stay silent. His actions that night, washing his clothes, hiding his boots, weren't just suspicious. They were fearful. And fear doesn't always come from guilt. Sometimes it comes from knowing. In the days after, Chris became obsessed. He watched the news for hours. He ranted, speculated. But Jackie noticed something odd. He never asked the one question that everyone else did. Who could have done this? He already seemed to know. One night, as they watched coverage of the funeral, Chris muttered under his breath, "No, they'll get what they deserve." Jackie didn't understand what that meant. Not fully. But she never forgot it. Jackie acknowledged it. Maybe Chris was just weird. Maybe his behaviors, his paranoia, his mood swings, maybe they had nothing to do with the murder. Maybe she wanted to find patterns that weren't there. But when a man comes home covered in dirt, refuses to speak, throws his clothes in the wash, hides his boots, and starts ranting about the victim's family on the night a 6-year-old girl is murdered in their town, it stops feeling like coincidence. And it starts feeling like danger. Interpreting the evidence Jackie gave. It's one thing to remember details. It's another to write them down, organize them, and submit them to law enforcement. Jackie DILSON didn't just tell a story, she built a case. What she provided wasn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but it was pattern, context, and urgency. And perhaps most importantly, it was early. Her warnings came before media theories, before public pressure. And yet, the system didn't move. Let's look closer. Let's look at the timeline first. It's too specific to ignore. Jackie's timeline wasn't vague. It was hour by hour. She noted when Chris left, when he returned, what he wore, how he moved, what he said. These weren't faded memories collected years after the fact. They were recorded as they happened, while the feeling was still raw. The strength of this timeline isn't in any one entry but in the consistency. There's no guessing. There's no inflation. Just routine turned abnormal. The timeline shows disruption, a man out late, refusing to speak, hiding his boots. When someone goes to those lengths to erase their tracks, it demands explanation. For the physical descriptions, Jackie described the boots Chris wore in detail. She believed they matched the description of unidentified boot prints found at the scene. She couldn't prove it. But she noted the sole pattern. The wear, the deep tread. This isn't a smoking gun, but it's a flare. And when paired with a man washing those very clothes the second he walks in the door, it becomes more than coincidence. For the pattern of the language, Chris didn't just talk about the Ramseys. He seethed. His commentary wasn't that of a citizen reacting to tragedy. It was more like someone watching a plan unfold or someone trying to convince themselves they weren't involved. Jackie's notes preserve specific phrases. They had it coming. This'll blow up huge. Fake as hell. These aren't neutral. They're loaded. And they're deeply personal. This wasn't a detachment. It was an investment. Jackie gave her report to Boulder PD. She asked to speak to someone. No one followed up. She wrote to John Ramsey. No response. This isn't just a failure of forensics. It's a failure of listening. She wasn't asking for a conviction. She was asking for an interview. What does it say about a system when a first-hand witness can deliver this of detail and be met with silence? To this day, it remains unclear if Chris Wolf's DNA was ever collected. That's not just a missed opportunity. It's a haunting omission. In an investigation paralyzed by lack of physical evidence, the refusal to even test a suspect named by his live in partner within days of the murder defies logic. Jackie didn't have one explosive piece of evidence. She had a series of small, consistent, timely observations. And those add up. They show a man trying to disappear parts of himself. They show a system that didn't want the complication. They show a version of truth that was inconvenient. And in murder cases, inconvenient truths are often the ones that matter most. Psychological portrait. Jackie DILSON and Chris Wolf. Jackie DILSON wasn't the type of woman who made accusations lightly. She didn't act on impulse. She didn't tell dramatic stories. People around her described her as measured, almost withdrawn, someone who paid attention more than she spoke. And in that stillness, she noticed everything. Chris Wolfe was a harder read. At a distance, he looked intelligent, sharp-eyed, articulate, and principled. But close up, those same traits became difficult. His principles became paranoia. His articulations turned to rants. His sharpness cut too deep. Jackie had lived with both versions of him, the one who could talk politics over coffee, and the one who would shut down completely, storming around the apartment as if the whole world had wronged him. The night of December 25, 1996, became a psychological rupture for Jackie. She had always sensed instability in Chris, but that night sharpened everything. When he walked through the door, clothes filthy, boots hidden, eyes evasive, she didn't just see a man returning late. She saw someone who had crossed a line, even if she didn't know what it was yet. And for someone like Jackie, who processed the world by patterns and small details, that shift was impossible to ignore. What's striking is how she responded. She didn't confront him. She didn't demand explanations. She documented. That response is telling. It speaks of someone who has already learned what confrontation gets her nothing. Jackie's mind worked like a slow burn investigator. Not through confrontation, but accumulation. Detail by detail. Quote by quote. She didn't panic. She prepared. This speaks to a powerful psychological instinct. When someone feels powerless in a relationship, but observant enough to detect danger, they often shift into a role of passive vigilance. Jackie didn't scream. She took notes. And that act of writing wasn't just for the police. It was for her. A way to stay sane in a reality that had just turned slippery. Chris, on the other hand, exhibits traits commonly associated with high-functioning narcissism and latent aggression. His hatred of the Ramseys wasn't ideological, it was personal. Jackie described it not as mere criticism, but as disgust. That distinction matters. Disgust is deeper. It's dehumanizing. It says, "You aren't just wrong, you're beneath me." Chris often ranted about the media, the elite, and the fawniness of suburban wealth. But this wasn't social commentary, it was projection. The very things he said he hated were the things he believed had rejected him. In Jackie's recollection, Chris didn't just despise the Ramseys because they were rich, he despised them because they were noticed. Vizinihif. He wasn't. And JonBenét, though, just a child, represented something that, to Chris, was unbearable. Manufactured perfection. Pageants. Cameras. Attention. The public eye. To someone already struggling with identity and significance, that image can become a trigger. Not because of the person themselves, but because of what they symbolize. JonBenét wasn't a girl to him. She was a billboard of everything he resented. This is where the psychological danger lies. When a person begins to see symbols instead of people, they can justify any act in their mind. They stop responding to human pain and begin reacting to personal offense. And that offense, if untreated, often escalates in isolation. Jackie said Chris was obsessed with control. If things slipped outside his expectations, he lashed out verbally, emotionally, sometimes physically. After the murder, his behavior didn't resemble grief or curiosity. It resembled containment. Not the reaction of someone shocked, but someone who already knew what had happened. He didn't ask, "Who could have done this?" He said, "They had it coming." That's not a slip. That's a window. Jackie's trauma didn't end with what she witnessed that night. It extended into the weeks after, when she realized no one would listen. The police didn't call back. Her timeline was filed, but not followed up on. No detective showed up at her door. Psychologically, this triggered what trauma experts call institutional betrayal. The feeling of being doubly harmed, not just by the danger you witnessed, but by the system's refusal to respond. That deepens the damage. It erodes trust. And for Jackie, it isolated her even further. Her response? She kept writing. Because in absence of justice, documentation is all you have. Chris, meanwhile, seemed to settle back into obscurity. He filed a defamation lawsuit against the Ramseys, insisting he had been wrongly accused by their book. But even that lawsuit felt, to Jackie, more like performance than protest. A way to reframe himself as the victim. That's the final psychological twist, when someone who may hold answers paints themselves as the one needing protection. What makes Chris Wolf dangerous in Jackie's eyes isn't what he did or didn't confess. It's what he made her feel and how long that feeling lasted. Long after she moved out. Long after the timeline was shelved. Long after his name disappeared from headlines. That fear stayed. Because some threats don't leave bruises. They just leave silence. Missed chances and mistakes. It's easy to assume that justice is a straight line. That someone speaks up, someone else listens, and the truth follows in neat succession. But what happens when that chain breaks? When a voice is dismissed? When evidence is shelved, or worse, lost? What happens is the story of Jackie Wilson. And the silence that swallowed everything she tried to say. Jackie did everything she could. She kept records. She followed timelines. She wrote down the disturbing comments Chris Wolf made after the death of JonBenét Ramsey. She documented the night he came home late, muddy, shaken, and threw his clothes in the wash without a word. She described the boots he hid in the back of the closet. The way he talked about the Ramsey family with venom in his voice. The way he mocked the case. The way he seemed amused by it. She packaged it all meticulously and brought it to the people whose job it was to follow the truth, the Boulder Police Department. And they did nothing. No one called her back. No one cross-examined her. No one checked to see if the boots matched the prints at the scene. No one, to this day, has confirmed if Chris Wolf's DNA was ever tested. Jackie followed up. She sent the material again. She asked questions. She tried to stay hopeful. But eventually, the silence told her everything. They weren't going to look. And if they had already decided who they thought was guilty, why would they? That theory that the investigation was compromised from the start isn't hers alone. John Ramsey, the father of JonBenét, would say years later, "They decided it was me on day one." And it wasn't hyperbole. From the moment the ransom note was found, before JonBenét's body was even discovered in the basement, detectives zeroed in on the family. The note, handwritten and bizarre, seemed staged. The circumstances, no sign of forced entry. A high-profile family. A history of pageantry made for a media storm. And in that storm, the easiest story to tell was one that stayed within the walls of the house. There was a problem with that strategy, though. The DNA found on JonBenét's clothing didn't match any member of the Ramsey family. Still, investigators clung to their theory. They dismissed outside leads. They minimized alternative suspects. They turned away people like Jackie Wilson, citizens without legal credentials but with something equally valuable: information. Jackie remembers one conversation clearly. She had asked an officer if they had tested the items she submitted. He looked at her and said, "We're not even sure what we tested." She walked out of that meeting stunned. How does that happen? How does a department responsible for solving the brutal murder of a 6-year-old girl lose track of evidence? How does a sworn investigator say, with a straight face, that they can't confirm whether a suspect's name was ever run through the lab? But that wasn't the end of it. Years later, as new documentaries and media specials revisited the case, Jackie kept watching. She waited to hear Chris Wolf's name. It never came. Not in the Netflix documentary that reignited public interest. Not in the popular YouTube breakdowns that claimed to reveal everything. Not in the books. Not in the podcasts. He was invisible, and Jackie knew why. After his failed defamation lawsuit against the Ramseys, Chris Wolf had become radioactive. No one wanted to risk getting sued. No one wanted to reopen a thread that might lead nowhere, or worse, somewhere painful and politically inconvenient. So they left him out. And for the public, he never existed. But people started to notice. In Reddit threads, comment sections, and forum posts, a few voices began asking, "Wait, who's this guy Chris Wolf that some people keep mentioning?" And when they looked deeper, when they read Jackie's name, when they heard her story, the questions got sharper. Why didn't they take his now? Why wasn't he interviewed on camera? If she gave them that much information, why wasn't it followed up? And there were no good answers. The Boulder Police Department, when pressed, offered no comment. No confirmation. No denial. Just a statement that the investigation remained ongoing and that they were reviewing all evidence with fresh eyes. But for Jackie, that promise came decades too late. She had already lived through the part where they ignored her. She had already endured the silence. And now, the public was catching up. People began to realize what had been lost: not just time, not just leads, but the integrity of the process itself. They began to understand that justice isn't just about catching the killer. It's about listening to the people brave enough to say, "I think something's wrong." And Jackie had done that. Repeatedly. Only to be buried by a system more interested in protecting it and correcting its course. The most painful part. She doesn't even know if Chris Wolf has ever been cleared. There is no official record. No press release. No case file entry she's seen. For all she knows, the man she believes came home after killing a child has never had to account for where he was that night. Never had to explain the boots. Never had to explain the laundry. Never had to explain the words he spoke when he thought no one was listening. And maybe that's the real tragedy of the JonBenét Ramsey case. Not just the life stolen, but the truths ignored. The people like Jackie who stood up and said, "Look here," only to have the world turn its head the other way. We like to believe mistakes in investigations are rare. That incompetence is the exception, not the rule. But what if the truth is uglier? What if the most important clue was handed to police on paper, and they filed it under nuisance? What if the murder of JonBenét Ramsey was solvable? And what if we missed the chance because someone at a desk decided that Jackie Wilson didn't look like a witness? What if they were wrong? And what if they never looked again? The digital trial. For over 2 decades, Chris Wolf's name barely appeared in public conversations about the JonBenét Ramsey case. While documentaries rehashed theories about intruders, family secrets, or bizarre confessions from false claimants, one name slipped through the cracks. But then, the internet happened. And suddenly, silence had nowhere to hide. It started small. A Reddit thread here, a YouTube comment there. Mentions of a man who dated a woman named Jackie Wilson. A man who came home late on the night of the murder. A man who wasn't on camera, wasn't arrested, and wasn't mentioned in the Netflix documentary that claimed to explore every theory. The question came slowly, and then all at once. Who the hell is Chris Wolf, and why haven't we talked about him? In comment sections beneath videos with millions of views, strangers began piecing together fragments. A user shared that Wolf had filed a defamation lawsuit against the Ramseys. Another posted a quote from court documents. Someone else mentioned Jackie, how she'd submitted detailed records to the Boulder police and never heard back. And then, one question echoed again and again. Why hasn't his knob been tested? It was the kind of question that cuts through noise. Because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't conspiratorial. It was logical. And it had no clear answer. In a world that now runs on digital trails and forensic podcasts, the idea that a key suspect might have been ignored entirely was enraging. Supporters of Jackie flooded threads with summaries of her story. They cited her notes, her timeline, the boots, the laundry, the things Chris had said about JonBenét and the Ramseys. They repeated John Ramsey's own words from a 2024 interview, where he described Jackie as very solid and consistent. Some users compiled timelines that aligned Jackie's account with known public data: news releases, 911 calls, police statements. And though no one could prove guilt, what emerged was undeniable: Chris Wolf had not been ruled out. Not officially. Not clearly. Not publicly. And that was enough to reopen the door, at least online. But with that came resistance. For every supporter urging authorities to Just test his DNA. There were skeptics pushing back. There's no physical evidence. It's all circumstantial. You can't ruin someone's life based on an ex-girlfriend's gut feeling. And they weren't wrong. Chris Wolf hadn't been arrested. No fingerprints. No confession. No video. And Jackie, while compelling, didn't have hard proof, only words, timelines, and instincts. What followed was more than debate. It became a cultural rift. On one side were those who said, "We have to believe women. We've ignored them too long. That's why predators get away." On the other, belief isn't evidence. Feelings aren't enough. We have to protect the presumption of innocence. And in the middle, a child who never got justice. A case that remained cold. A suspect who, somehow, remained untested. Internet sleuths dove deeper. Some tracked Chris Wolf's articles from the late 1990s, trying to parse meaning from what he chose to write or not write. Others claimed he went unusually quiet during the months following the murder. Some found photos of the kind of boots Jackie described and tried to match tread patterns with the crime scene images released by police. The goal wasn't conviction. It was clarity. Was this man ever investigated seriously? Was his DNA collected? Did anyone even ask where he was that night? The silence from Boulder police grew heavier. No statement. No updates. No transparency. In forums where people typically argued about cameras and lighting in documentaries, a more sophisticated question emerged. How many other Jackie Wilsons have we ignored? Her story wasn't just about Chris Wolf anymore. It was about the system. The tendency to dismiss inconvenient witnesses. The habit of following the path of least resistance. The fear of reopening mistakes. Jackie had said it best in an old interview. "I didn't ask them to arrest him. I asked them to look." And now, the internet was asking the same thing. Look. Just look. Because while Chris Wolf had all but vanished from the official narrative, his presence online was growing. Each time his name appeared in a thread, someone new learned his story. Each time Jackie's notes were someone else asked why they hadn't been reviewed. The digital trial wasn't about verdicts. It was about visibility. And Chris Wolf, for the first time in 25 years, was visible again. John and Pasty Ramsey also suspected that Chris Wolf was involved in their daughter's death. They mentioned him in a book called The Death of Innocence. The Death of Innocence. The untold story of JonBenét's murder and how its exploitation compromised the pursuit of truth is a memoir written by John and Patsy Ramsey, first published in March 2000 by Thomas Nelson. The book recounts the events surrounding the tragic murder of their 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét Ramsey, who was found dead in the basement of the family's Boulder, Colorado home on Christmas morning, 1996. Through this deeply personal narrative, the Ramseys vehemently deny any involvement in their daughter's death and portray themselves as victims of a flawed, politless media scrutiny. They criticize the Boulder Police Department's handling of the case, claiming that the investigators fixated on the family too early while ignoring other potential suspects. The book also explores the emotional exhaustion they experienced, their reliance on faith to survive the ordeal, and their ongoing pursuit of justice for JonBenét. A significant portion of the book is dedicated to countering what they describe as misinformation propagated by tabloids and news outlets. The Ramseys take aim at how the media sensationalized their wealth and pageant lifestyle, painting JonBenét as a child obsessed with beauty contests. A characterization, they argue, is both inaccurate and unfair. They attempt to humanize their daughter and reclaim her image, while simultaneously shifting suspicion toward the theory of an intruder, citing unconfirmed DNA evidence found on JonBenét's clothing that allegedly did not match anyone in the family. This claim would later be used by the Boulder District Attorney in 2008 to issue a controversial public apology and declaration of the Ramseys' innocence. However, the book received mixed reviews. Supporters praised it for offering a raw, emotional perspective from grieving parents and for challenging what they saw as a media-driven narrative. Critics, on the other hand, accused the Ramseys of using the memoir to manipulate public perception, focusing more on their own reputations than on seeking the truth. Some pointed out that the language of the book, particularly its emotional tone and rhetorical style, oddly mirrored the infamous ransom note found at the crime scene, further fueling suspicions. Others criticized the book's emphasis on the Ramseys' social status and wealth, suggesting it made them appear disconnected from the public. Despite the controversy, the death of innocence remains one of the most significant personal accounts related to the JonBenét Ramsey case. It serves as both a defense of the family's innocence and a case study in how media, public opinion, and flawed investigations can complicate the pursuit of justice. Though compelling in its emotion and narrative, the book should be read with a critical eye, as it reflects the perspective of two individuals who were, for years, considered prime suspects in one of America's most haunting unsolved murders. In 2000, Wolf filed a defamation lawsuit against John and Patsy Ramsey for their book, which falsely painted him as a possible suspect in JonBenét's murder. It was the first time Wolf's name had entered the public sphere in connection to the case. But rather than use the opportunity to tell his side of the story, he let the court process do the talking. And when the case was dismissed in 2003, that was it. No appeals. No public statement. No denial in front of flashing lights. He walked away. And the world never really heard from him again. The court ruling didn't say Wolf was guilty. But it didn't clear him either. It simply ruled that the Ramseys had a constitutional right to express their suspicions, especially given the trauma they had endured. That nuance didn't vindicate anyone. It left a gap in the narrative that neither side chose to fill. So Wolf became something else that lingered in the margins. Not charged. Not cleared. Just there. A shadow on the edge of a crime scene that refuses to fade. In the years that followed, true crime podcasts exploded. Documentaries ran on every major network. Theories were proposed, dissected, discarded. But rarely, almost never, was Chris Wolf's name mentioned. He wasn't interviewed. He wasn't quoted. He wasn't even listed among the many so-called fringe suspects. Somehow, despite living with a woman who openly suspected him, he didn't make the cut. Some say that's because there was nothing there. No physical evidence. No proof of anything other than Jackie's testimony. But others wonder, if Jackie was so detailed, so specific, so consistent, why was she ignored? Why weren't her claims tested more aggressively? Why wasn't Wolf eliminated with certainty? To this day, we don't know if Chris Wolf's DNA was ever collected. We don't know what was done with Jackie's timeline or her notes. All we know is that a man came home that night acting in a way that terrified the person closest to him, and somehow, that story got buried. And maybe that's the real story here. Not that Chris Wolf was the killer, but that no one really tried to find out if he was. And maybe that was the plan all along. Not to prove anything. Not to fight back. Just to slip beneath the noise. To wait out the storm. And let time do what silence couldn't. Erase it out. Or at least bury it deep enough that no one would bother to dig again. Jackie's book and the reawakening. For years, Jackie Wilson's voice echoed in empty rooms. She spoke, documented, called, waited. And nothing changed. No headlines. No press conferences. No justice. But silence has a limit. And Jackie had reached hers. In 2024, nearly 3 decades after the murder of JonBenét Ramsey, Jackie made one would speak for her, she'd speak for herself. Loudly. Publicly. Permanently. She began writing. What started as a collection of notes, timelines, and fragments became something larger, a manuscript. A witness record. A survivor's log. Not of violence, but of neglect. A document not just of what happened the night JonBenét died, but what didn't happen afterward. What the police ignored. What the media overlooked. What justice had refused to acknowledge. The book is called The Boots in the Closet. It's not a tell-all, it's a tell. Again, the same Jackie's been telling for years, this time with pages, binding, and ISBN. International Standard Book number. She details everything. The night Chris Wolf came home shaking and silent. The way he threw his clothes in the washer without a word. The boots. The strange rants about the Ramsey family. The dark jokes about children. The documents she handed to the Boulder Police Department. The questions they never asked. The Dina they never requested. It's all in there. And this time, people are reading. Within weeks of the book's announcement, true crimes lit up. Podcasts began requesting interviews. Independent journalists began quoting her directly. Even mid-sized news outlets started revisiting the name Chris Wolf, not as a dismissed rumor, but as a legitimate lead buried under decades of silence. One article posed the question plainly. How does a man with this many red flags escape public scrutiny for nearly 30 years? Jackie didn't have the answer, but she had the receipts. The book includes photocopies of her original notes, dated pages, transcripts of what she submitted to police. She even includes screenshots of the few, vague responses she received non-committal form letters. The kind that say everything by saying nothing. And then something unexpected happened. The Boulder Police Department, after years of silence, took a meeting. John Ramsey confirmed that he and his legal advisors had recently sat down with the cold case unit. According to him, the meeting was professional, focused, and for the first time in a long time, hopeful. They didn't promise answers, but they promised attention. Ramsey shared this in a brief public statement. We met with Boulder PD last month. They are looking back at everything, every file, every name, every possibility. That includes people the public hasn't heard about. He didn't say Chris Wolf's name. He didn't have to. The timing said it for him. And Jackie. She wasn't celebrating. Not yet. But she was listening. Watching. Waiting again. She knows how this works. 1 week of headlines. One burst of interest. And then, nothing. Again. But this time, something feels different. Because it's not just her voice anymore. It's the readers who post excerpts from her book, with comments like, "How did we miss this? This woman gave them everything. This should have been followed up in 1996. It's the podcasters building multi-episode series titled things like, The Forgotten File, Chris Wolf and the Woman Who Wouldn't Shut Up. It's people tweeting directly at Boulder PD demanding updates. And it's John Ramsey who, despite decades of grief, still insists on one more test. Because the Dina profile found on JonBenét's clothing remains unsolved. A foreign male profile. Not from her family. Not from law enforcement. Not from any known suspect. It's degraded. Small. But usable. Ren leaves that modern forensic genealogy, the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer, can crack it. All they need is one match. A distant cousin. A family tree. A name. And if Chris Wolf is innocent, then this could finally clear him. And if he's not, then maybe justice, long overdue, can still find its way through the cracks. Jackie's book isn't the end of the story. But it might be the spark that reignites it. Because now, the silence is breaking. And once enough people start asking why, the system has to answer. Even if it's 30 years too late. Where things stand today. Chris Wolf is still alive. It's a fact that startles people when they hear it for the first time. After nearly 3 decades, dozens of documentaries, and a cold case that has haunted America since 1996, you'd think every serious suspect would have been exhausted, exonerated, or erased from public view. But Chris Wolf remains in a strange space. Not convicted. Not cleared. Not forgotten, but not remembered either. He has never been arrested. Never charged. Never even officially named by the Boulder Police Department as a person of interest. And yet, he lingers just outside the frame of the narrative. Jackie Wilson remembers the last time she saw him. He was silent. He knew she'd told someone. Maybe the police. Maybe the Ramseys. Maybe both. He never said a word. Just looked at her with an expression that could have meant anything or everything. She moved out. He disappeared. And for years, that was it. No media coverage. No investigations. No confirmation that Chris Wolf had ever been asked the most basic question a suspect should be asked. Where were you that night? It's a question that still hasn't been answered. And, maybe more alarming, it's a question that still hasn't been asked. Not publicly. Not officially. Jackie, who has spent decades telling her story, still doesn't know if police ever tested Chris Wolf's DNA. She documented her experience. She waited. But even after publishing her book, there's been no word. Jon Ramsey doesn't know either. In his recent interviews, he's said it bluntly. That's a good question. I don't know if they ever did. How does a murder case, one that galvanized the nation, gripped tabloids, and inspired entire industries of speculation, get this far with such a glaring omission? It's a question that doesn't just haunt Jackie anymore. It haunts everyone who's followed this case with any degree of seriousness. Because the truth is simple. Meet the most concrete forensic clue in the entire JonBenét Ramsey investigation is a mailed now profile found on her clothing and under her fingernails. But that profile doesn't match her father, or her mother, or her brother. It doesn't match any member of the family. It doesn't match the officers who responded to the scene. It doesn't match known friends, family members, or prior household visitors. It matches no one in the system. That DNA profile, small, degraded, partial, is still there. Still waiting. And for reasons that remain unclear, no one can say whether Chris Wolf has ever been tested against it. That kind of silence feels heavy. Not just for Jackie. Not just for the Ramseys. But for every person who has spent hours, days, years trying to make sense of what happened in that house on Christmas night. Because this case isn't just unsolved. It's suspended. Frozen in a kind of limbo, where names can float uninvestigated for decades, and key suspects can fade from public consciousness without ever being cleared. But there is one new development. One sliver of hope. The Boulder Police Department has reopened the investigation under a cold case unit, reportedly bringing in outside consultants, forensic specialists, and fresh eyes. According to Jon Ramsey, they have committed to reviewing every file, every name, every lead. It's not a promise of justice, but it's a start. At the same time, advances in forensic science have opened a door that didn't exist back in 1996. A door called forensic genetic genealogy. It's the technique that caught the Golden State Killer. The method works like this: even if a suspect's DNA isn't in any criminal database, investigators can upload unidentified DNA to a public genealogy platform. If any partial match appears, say, a third cousin or great-grandnephew, that connection can lead to a family tree. A name, a new direction. And the profile found in JonBenét's case, while small, is viable. Experts believe that if allowed, that profile could yield a relative, a location, a suspect. All they need is permission, and funding, and time, and courage. Because reopening old cases doesn't just mean running tests. It means facing what those tests might reveal. Mistakes. Overlooked opportunities. People who should have been questioned and weren't. Names that should have been tested and weren't. It means asking why. Why wasn't Chris Wolf tested? Why did Jackie's testimony fall through the cracks? Why is it still unclear, after almost 30 years, whether one of the earliest civilian witnesses in the case was ever taken seriously? Why hasn't the public been given answers? The silence from Boulder PD continues. No statements. No clarifications. Just the occasional reminder that the case remains open. That they are still working. That they cannot comment on ongoing investigations. And that's where things stand today. Chris Wolf is still alive. He's never been charged. Never been ruled out. And unless someone asks the question and gets the answer, he may never be. But the case isn't over. Not for Jackie. Not for Jon Ramsey. Not for the thousands of people who still believe that justice is possible. Even after decades of failure. Because justice doesn't always arrive on time. But sometimes, if the right people ask the right questions, it shows up anyway. Late. But not gone. A name, a shadow. What if the truth was never really gone? What if it wasn't some deeply buried secret, locked away in an attic box, or concealed by conspiracies? What if the truth was always there, sitting quietly in a stack of ignored files, overlooked emails, and statements, Nobody wanted to read, because reading them meant admitting that we missed something important, that we made mistakes, that we looked in the wrong direction for too long. Chris Wolf. A name that never made it into the headlines, never became part of the mainstream narrative, and never triggered public outrage the way others did. And yet, his name was there from the beginning, off to the side, in the periphery, spoken quietly by one woman, Jackie Wilson. She didn't scream. She didn't make demands. She just told her story. The man she was living with came home late the night JonBenét was murdered. He was sweating, silent. His clothes were dirty. He went straight to the washing machine, something he never did. She found boots hidden behind old tax folders. Boots she believed matched marks found at the Ramsey home. She wrote it all down. Everything, his words, his behavior, the way he talked about the Ramseys, the way he said, "They're lying," before anyone else had even said the word, suspect. She submitted it all to the police. Nothing happened up. No questions. No test. Jackie kept waiting. She waited while the media turned the Ramsey family inside out. She waited while documentaries speculated on pineapple and ransom notes. She waited while every theory except hers was aired, dissected, and sensationalized. And through it all, Chris Wolf remained untouched, uncharged, unquestioned, uninvestigated, not cleared, just ignored. Eventually, Jackie had enough. She wrote a book. Not to accuse, but to document. Not to convict, but to demand clarity. And slowly, people started paying attention. Not many, not loudly, but enough to raise a question that should have been asked 30 years ago. What if we just tested his DNA? What if that's all it takes, a single swab to finally close a door, or open one we've been afraid to look behind? Chris Wolf might be innocent, but we don't know, because no one ever confirmed it. The most powerful piece of evidence in the JonBenét Ramsey case isn't speculation or theory, it's DNA. A small, partial, male profile on JonBenét's clothing and under her fingernails. It doesn't match her father, or her brother, or any known family member. It doesn't match law enforcement or household staff. It matches no one in the national database. It has never matched Chris Wolf because, as far as we know, his DNA was never collected. That's not justice. That's not due process. That's silence. And silence isn't closure. It's delay. Delay dressed up as caution. Delay disguised as, "We're still working on it." But justice delayed, especially for a child who had the chance to grow up, is justice denied. And JonBenét has been denied justice for nearly 3 decades. The irony is this: we now live in a world where forensic genealogy can solve cases that went cold before the internet existed. One DNA swab, run through the right system, can trace familial lines, narrow suspects, and identify killers who thought time would protect them. All it takes is access, willingness, and action. And yet, in this case, we still haven't tested every name. We haven't checked every sample. We haven't ruled out the one a credible witness flagged the night it happened. Why? Is it pride? Is it fear? Is it laziness? Or is it just the all too familiar refusal of institutions to admit when they got it wrong? Chris Wolf has never had to answer the simplest, most vital question in a murder case: where were you? He was never held accountable, not even to the truth. And until that changes, the shadow will remain. It will hang over Jackie Wilson, over the Ramseys, over the city of Boulder, over everyone who's dared to believe this case could be solved if someone just asked the right question at the right time. And maybe that time is now. Because justice isn't found in theories. It isn't delivered by documentaries. It's earned through action. It requires courage. It demands confrontation. And it doesn't come from the stories we tell to comfort ourselves. It comes from the stories we're willing to tell when we know they'll hurt. JonBenét Ramsey deserves better than shadows. She deserves truth. And the truth begins with a name. A name we buried. A name we avoided. A name we must finally face. Chris Wolf may be innocent, but justice can't assume. It must confirm. And that starts with a swab, a match, a moment of honesty. One that's 30 years late, but still not too late. Justice isn't a moment. It's not a single arrest or headline. It's a process slow, relentless, often painful. It's the willingness to ask the questions no one wanted to hear, to go back when everyone else has moved on, to turn over the stones that were buried long ago, sometimes on purpose. JonBenét Ramsey was only 6 years old. She never had a chance to speak for herself. But maybe we still can. Not by assigning blame in haste, not by chasing sensational theories, but by confronting the silences we allowed to settle in. Chris Wolf may be innocent. But until we know truly, thoroughly, undeniably know, we haven't done our job. We haven't honored the weight of that little girl's life. We haven't finished the story. One DNA swab. One act of transparency. One question asked out loud, without fear. That's what it could take to shift everything. Because silence isn't resolution. Silence is avoidance. And justice doesn't survive in shadows. The files are still there. The name is still there. The questions are still unanswered. But so is the hope that someone, someday, will finally say enough. Enough ignoring. Enough assuming. Let's finish what we started. Not for the headlines. Not for the cameras. But for her. Because every child deserves the truth. And JonBenét deserves more than memory. She deserves answers. And so long as a single shadow remains one name, untested and unexplained, the case isn't closed. It's only paused. Justice isn't time-bound. But it is truth-bound. And truth has a way of surviving, even in silence.